The weeping rust of Blackwood, the Pale Rider. The year was 1893, and the sun did not shine upon the town of Blackwood, New Mexico. It hammered it. It was a brutal, white-hot anvil in a sky so bleached of color it looked like the dead eye of a fish. The heat wasn't just a temperature. It was a physical presence, a suffocating weight that pressed the breath out of lungs and turned the dust of the main street into a choking, dry fog. Sheriff Silas Thorne sat on the warped wooden bench outside his office, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the glare. He was a man carved from the same hard earth as the canyon walls that surrounded the town. Rugged, silent, and worn down by years of searching the worst humanity had to offer. He held a piece of dry cedar in his calloused hands, his knife peeling away thin, curling strips of wood with a rhythmic shh-shh sound. It was the only sound in the world. Blackwood was unnaturally quiet today. Usually, by high noon, the Lucky Nugget Saloon would be spilling noise into the street, the tinny rattle of a piano, the shouts of miners arguing over a card game, the clink of glass. But today, the heat had driven everyone into the shadows. Even the stray dogs had crawled under the boardwalks, panting in the dirt, their tongues lolling out like strips of raw meat. Silas stopped whittling. He didn't look up, but his hand drifted instinctively to the worn walnut grip of his Colt Peacemaker on his hip. The hair on his arms stood on end. The silence had changed. It wasn't just the quiet of the heat anymore. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. He lifted his head and squinted towards the northern horizon, where the heat haze made the desert floor shimmer like a vast boiling lake of mercury. Something was coming. At first, it was just a black speck, distorting and wavering in the mirage. Silas watched it for 10 minutes, sweat trickling down his spine, cold despite the furnace-like air. As the speck grew, it took the shape of a horse and rider. But they were moving wrong. There was no rhythm to their gait, no rise and fall of a gallop or a trot. They moved with a staggering, lurching slowness that was painful to watch. Silas stood up, his knees cracking. He brushed the cedar shavings from his trousers and stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked to the center of the main street and stood there, a lone figure barring the way. The rider drew closer. The sound of the horse's hooves reached him now, but it wasn't the rhythmic clop-clop of iron shoes on hard-packed earth. It was a dragging, scraping sound. Scrape, thud, drag. As the details sharpened, Silas felt a knot of dread tighten in his stomach. The horse was a magnificent stallion, jet black, but it was in a state of catastrophic ruin. Its head hung so low, its muzzle nearly brushed the dirt. Thick, white foam lathered its neck and flanks, but the foam was tinged with streaks of brownish red. The animal was emaciated, its ribs protruding sharply against its skin, but the skin itself looked wrong. It didn't look like hide. It looked tight, dry and greyish, like old parchment stretched over a cage of bones. And the rider. The man was slumped forward in the saddle, his body swaying dangerously with every lurch of the beast. He wore a long, dusty duster coat that had once been black but was now stained with the pale dust of the road. His hat was gone, exposing a head of thinning, stringy hair that was plastered to his skull with sweat and something darker, something like oil. "Hold up!" Silas called out, his voice sounding thin and small in the vast emptiness of the canyon. "State your business, stranger." The rider did not respond. He didn't even lift his head. The horse kept coming, blind and deaf to the sheriff's command. Silas put his hand on his gun, not drawing it but ready. "I said hold up. You're riding into Blackwood. Identify yourself." The horse took 3 more agonizing steps, and then, without a whinny or a snort, it simply ceased to function. Its front legs buckled. It didn't fall like a horse usually falls, scrambling to regain balance. It collapsed like a building whose foundations had been blasted away. The beast hit the ground with a heavy, wet impact that shook the dust around it. The rider was thrown clear. He tumbled over the horse's neck and hit the dirt with a sickening thud, a sound devoid of the natural elasticity of a human body. It sounded like a sack of wet gravel hitting a stone floor. Silas ran forward, forgetting the heat, forgetting the caution. "Doc Miller, get out here!" he roared, his voice echoing off the saloon walls. He reached the fallen stranger just as the door to the general store burst open, and Doc Miller, a bespectacled man with whiskey on his breath and blood on his apron, ran out. Silas knelt beside the stranger and reached out to turn him over. The moment his fingers brushed the man's shoulder, he recoiled. The heat radiating off the body was intense, burning through the thick fabric of the duster. It was like touching a stove. "Careful, Silas!" Doc Miller skidded to a halt in the dust, breathless. "Don't touch any fluids." "He's burning up," Silas said, grabbing the stranger's shoulder more firmly this time and heaving him onto his back. The sight that greeted them made both men freeze. The stranger was young, perhaps no more than 25, but his face was a ruin of agony. His skin was pulled so taut against his skull that the shape of his teeth was visible beneath his lips, giving him a permanent skeletal grin. His complexion was a translucent, sickly grey, the colour of a storm cloud. But it was his eyes that stole the breath from Silas's lungs. The eyes were gone. In the sockets where eyes should have been, there were no whites, no irises, no pupils. There were only pools of thick, viscous liquid that shimmered with a metallic, coppery sheen. As the man's head lolled back, this liquid overflowed the rim of his eyelids and tracked down his cheeks. It wasn't blood. It looked like liquid rust. "Sweet Mother of God," Doc Miller whispered, crossing himself. A gesture Silas hadn't seen the cynical old doctor make in years. The stranger's chest hitched. A terrible rattling sound emerged from his throat, like marbles grinding together in a tin can. His mouth opened, the lips tearing apart with a sound like ripping paper, because they had been sealed shut by dried mucus. "The water," the man croaked. His voice was inhuman, distorted, as if his vocal cords had calcified. "What about the water?" Silas demanded, leaning close but trying not to breathe in the foul stench radiating from the man, a smell of sulfur, rotten eggs, and old wet iron. "Don't let it hatch," the stranger gasped. Then a violent convulsion seized him. His back arched off the ground, his spine bending to an impossible degree. We could hear the sound of things snapping inside him, not the sharp crack of bone, but the dull, heavy clunk of metal shearing. Suddenly, the horse behind them let out a sound that no animal on God's green earth should be capable of making. It was a high-pitched metallic shriek, like a train's brakes screaming on the tracks. Silas spun around, gun drawn. The horse was thrashing on the ground. As it kicked, a large abscess on its flank, swollen and pulsing, burst open. But no blood came out. Instead, a cloud of fine reddish-brown powder exploded into the air. It glittered in the sunlight like gold dust, swirling in the windless heat. "Cover your mouth!" Doc screamed, ripping his bandana from his neck and pressing it to his face. "Get back, Silas! That's not dust, that's spores!" Silas scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the dying animal. The reddish cloud hung in the air, drifting slowly toward them. Where the dust touched the wooden trough nearby, the wood instantly darkened, hissing as if touched by acid. The stranger on the ground grabbed Silas's boot. His grip was iron hard. Silas looked down. The man's hand was changing. The fingernails had turned black and fallen off, and the tips of his fingers were hardening, turning the color of dark slate. "Kill me," the stranger begged, the copper tears now streaming freely, staining the dust beneath his head. "Before I become it." Silas looked at the doc. The doc looked at the gun in Silas's hand. The decision hung in the boiling air, heavy and terrible. "He's not human anymore, Silas," Doc whispered, his voice trembling behind the bandana. "Look at his veins." Silas looked. Under the translucent grey skin of the man's neck, the veins were not blue. They were black, and they were writhing. Something was moving inside them, pushing through the bloodstream solid and sharp. The stranger's jaw locked open. A bubbling black froth rose from his throat, spilling over his chin. In the froth, Silas saw tiny glittering flecks, metal shavings. The man was coughing up pieces of himself. "Get him to the jail," Silas commanded, his voice shaking but authoritative. He holstered his gun, though every instinct screamed at him to put a bullet in the man's brain right there. We lock him up tight, and God help us all." As they lifted the man, Silas felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with the stranger's weight. It was the weight of a doom that had just arrived in Blackwood, riding a pale horse, bringing a pestilence that would turn flesh to stone and blood to rust. The anatomy of silence. The journey from the dusty street to the jailhouse was less than 50 yards, but it felt like a march through miles of treacherous swampland. The stranger was impossibly heavy. He didn't carry the weight of a man. He carried the dead, dense weight of a granite slab. Every time his boots dragged across the wooden boardwalk, they made a sound like stones grinding against a mill wheel. Silas grunted, the muscles in his back screaming as they hauled the man through the heavy oak door of the sheriff's office. The air inside was stagnant, trapped by the stone walls, smelling of old tobacco, gun oil, and now the overwhelming stench of the stranger. A smell that was sharply metallic, like a wet penny tasted on the tongue, mixed with the sweet, cloying odor of gangrene. "Cell 2!" Silas wheezed, kicking the barred door open. "Get him on the cot!" They dropped the man onto the thin, straw-stuffed mattress. The stranger didn't groan. He didn't shift to find comfort. He landed with a rigid wooden stiffness. His arm hit the metal frame of the bed with a hollow clank that made Doc Miller flinch. "Lock it," Doc said, his voice tight. He was already rolling up his sleeves, his hands trembling slightly as he reached into his leather medical bag. Silas slammed the cell door shut and turned the heavy iron key. The click of the lock usually made him feel secure, a definitive line between the law and the lawless. Today, it felt like locking himself in a cage with a monster. "I need light, Silas. Lots of it," Doc commanded, pulling out a bottle of carbolic acid and a scalpel. "And bring the bucket. If he vomits that black bile again, I don't want it touching the floor." Silas gathered 3 kerosene lanterns and hung them around the cell. The golden light flooded the small space, chasing away the shadows, but revealing the horror in stark, high definition. The stranger lay on his back, his duster coat falling open. His shirt was soaked through with a mixture of sweat and the oily, black substance leaking from his pores. Doc Miller approached cautiously, tying a fresh rag around his nose and mouth. He took a pair of shears and cut the stranger's shirt open. Silas gasped. The man's chest was a map of agony. The skin was no longer skin. It had hardened into a shell, resembling cracked porcelain or dry mud. Through the fissures in this grey casing, the raw flesh underneath pulsed. But it wasn't the healthy pink of muscle. It was dark, almost purple, and interwoven with those terrible black veins that looked like wires embedded in the meat. "I need to check his heart," Doc whispered, leaning in with his stethoscope. He placed the metal disc against the man's sternum. For a long moment, there was silence in the jailhouse. The only sound was the buzzing of a confused fly hitting the glass of a lantern. Doc Miller frowned. He tapped the stethoscope, then pressed it harder against the man's chest. His eyes went wide behind his spectacles. He pulled the earpieces out slowly, staring at the stranger with a look of pure bewilderment. "What is it?" Silas asked from the other side of the bars, his hand gripping the cold iron. "Is he dead?" "No," Doc whispered. "He's not dead. But, Silas, he doesn't have a heartbeat." "Don't talk nonsense, Doc. If he's breathing, he's got a heartbeat." "Listen for yourself." Doc shoved the stethoscope through the bars. Silas hesitated, then took the instrument. He walked around to the open side of the cell where Doc stood and cautiously placed the device on the stranger's chest. He closed his eyes and listened. There was no thump-thump, no rhythmic drumming of life. Instead, there was a sound that made Silas's blood run cold. Tick, whir, click. It was faint, wet, and muffled, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like the inner workings of a grandfather clock that had been submerged in mud. Gears grinding against each other, springs tensioning and releasing, a mechanical, rhythmic ticking coming from inside the human ribcage. "What in God's name?" Silas pulled away, dropping the stethoscope as if it had bitten him. "The rust," the stranger suddenly spoke. His voice was clearer now, but devoid of inflection. Like a machine mimicking human speech. He didn't open his eyes, he couldn't. The copper fluid had glued them shut, but his head snapped toward them with unnatural speed. "Tell us," Silas demanded, drawing his revolver and aiming it at the man's head. "What is happening to you? Is this cholera? Smallpox?" The stranger's lips peeled back in that rictus grin. "The iron blight, the gear grinder's plague. It comes from the water, from the deep veins of the earth where the old things sleep." "Silver Creek?" Silas remembered the man's words from the street. "You said Silver Creek?" "We dug too deep," the stranger rasped, his fingers twitching. The sound of his fingernails scratching the metal bed frame was like a file on steel. "The mine. We found a chamber. Walls of clockwork, rivers of mercury. We breathed the dust, and now we are the mechanism." "He's delirious," Doc Miller said, though he didn't sound convinced. He reached for the stranger's arm. "I'm going to try to bleed him, relieve the pressure. The toxicity in his blood must be off the charts." "Doc, wait!" Silas started, but Miller had already pressed the tip of the scalpel against the large vein in the stranger's forearm. He applied pressure. The skin didn't slice. It resisted. It felt like cutting into cured leather. Doc pushed harder, his knuckles whitening. With a sudden pop, the skin gave way. There was no spray of crimson. A thick black sludge oozed out, moving with the consistency of molasses. It piled up on the skin, refusing to run. And then something else came out. Clink. A small, solid object fell from the wound and hit the metal bedpan Doc had placed underneath. Then another clink, clink. Doc Miller stared at the pan. Lying in the pool of black sludge were 3 small, perfectly formed metal teeth. Not human teeth, gear teeth. Tiny, jagged triangles of iron. "His blood!" Doc stammered, backing away, the scalpel falling from his hand. "It's crystallizing. It's turning into parts." The stranger began to convulse again. This time, the violence of it was terrifying. His heels hammered against the cot with enough force to dent the metal. His back arched, and the sound of his spine cracking filled the room. A dry snapping sound like breaking kindling. "It is time!" the stranger screamed, his voice splitting into 2 overlapping tones, one human, one metallic and screeching. "Sedate him!" Silas yelled. "Knock him out, Doc!" "I can't!" Doc cried, fumbling for a bottle of chloroform. "His veins are solid. The needle won't go in." Suddenly, the stranger sat bolt upright. The movement was impossible. No leverage, no muscle preparation. Just a sudden 90-degree snap from horizontal to vertical. He reached up with his slate-grey hands and grabbed his own throat. "Don't!" Silas shouted. The stranger dug his fingers into his neck. He wasn't scratching an itch. He was tearing. He ripped the hardened grey skin away in strips, revealing not meat, but a dull, metallic sheen underneath. He tore at his windpipe, ripping away the soft tissue to expose a throat that looked like a ribbed iron pipe. "The mainspring is wound," the stranger gurgled. Then he stopped moving. He froze completely. The ticking in his chest stopped. The wheezing breath stopped. He sat there on the cot, a grotesque statue of half flesh, half metal, staring blindly at the wall with weeping copper eyes. "Is he dead?" Silas whispered, the gun shaking in his hand. Doc Miller leaned forward, trembling. I think, before he could finish, a loud crack echoed from outside the jailhouse. It sounded like a gunshot, but deeper. Then a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. "Jeremiah!" Silas realized. "The horse!" He spun around and ran for the door, throwing it open. The sun had set, and the twilight was purple and bruised. In the middle of the street where the horse had fallen, a crowd had gathered. They were backing away, horrified. Jeremiah, the town drunk, was standing over the carcass of the horse. But the horse was no longer a horse. The body had collapsed inward, dissolving into a pile of rust and black slime. Jeremiah was dancing. He was hopping from one foot to the other, clawing frantically at his clothes, tearing his shirt off. "Get it off me!" Jeremiah screamed, his voice ragged. "Get them out! They're crawling under my skin!" Silas ran toward him, but stopped 10 feet away. In the fading light, he could see it. Jeremiah's skin was rippling. Hundreds of tiny bumps were moving beneath the surface of his chest and arms, migrating, swarming like beetles under a rug. And from the pile of rust that used to be a horse, a cloud of red dust was rising again, drifting silently toward the open windows of the Lucky Nugget Saloon. The wind picked up. It carried the sound of the stranger inside the jailhouse, not a voice, but a sound like a heavy iron door slamming shut, over and over again. The incubation was over. The hatching had begun. The chorus of grinding gears. The sun had vanished completely now, leaving Blackwood submerged in a twilight that felt bruised and heavy. The air was still, terrifyingly so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Sheriff Silas Thorne stood in the middle of Main Street, his revolver drawn, pointing it at Jeremiah. But a gun felt like a foolish toy against what was unraveling before him. Jeremiah, the town drunk who had spent 40 years harmlessly stumbling between the stable and the bottle, was no longer harmless. He was a screaming monument to agony. He stood over the dissolved remains of the stranger's horse, his hands clawing at his own chest with a ferocity that shredded his shirt and the skin beneath. "It's heavy! Oh God, it's so heavy inside!" Jeremiah shrieked. His voice was changing. It was deepening, taking on a metallic resonance, like a shout echoing down a long drainage pipe. "Jeremiah, get down!" Silas roared, though he knew the order was useless. "Doc, stay back!" Jeremiah dropped to his knees. The impact cracked the dry earth. He looked up at Silas, his eyes wide and bloodshot. Then, right before Silas's eyes, the whites of Jeremiah's eyes flooded with that same coppery fluid. I can feel the wheels turning," Jeremiah whispered. He gagged, his jaw unhinged with a wet snap. He leaned forward and vomited. But it wasn't bile. It was a torrent of black oil mixed with small, sharp objects. They hit the dirt with a distinct clinking sound. Screws, washers, tiny jagged cogs. Then Jeremiah stiffened. His arms locked at his sides. His skin, already greying, suddenly rippled violently. With a sound like a bedsheet tearing, the flesh on his back split open. Silas flinched, expecting blood. Instead, a rib, black, oily, and made of cast iron, burst through the skin. Then another. The man's skeleton was expanding, growing, sharpening, tearing its way out of the soft prison of his flesh. Jeremiah tried to scream one last time, but his throat seized. A puff of rust-colored steam hissed from his open mouth and he froze. He didn't fall. He simply stopped, locked in a kneeling position, a grotesque statue of meat and metal steaming in the cool night air. "Sweet Jesus," Doc Miller breathed, standing in the doorway of the jail, his face a mask of horror. But there was no time to process the death. The cloud, the red glittering mist that had erupted from the horse and now from Jeremiah, was moving. It wasn't drifting with the wind, for there was no wind. It was moving with purpose. It rolled low over the ground, a predatory fog, heading straight for the lights and noise of the Lucky Nugget Saloon. The saloon, Silas realized, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting his heart. "Doc, get inside and lock the door. Don't open it for anyone." Silas holstered his gun and sprinted towards the saloon. The double doors were swung open, spilling golden light, and the jaunty tune of a ragtime piano onto the boardwalk. The place was packed. Miners, weary from the day, were drinking away their wages, oblivious to the nightmare that had just birthed itself in the street. "Close the doors!" Silas screamed as he hit the wooden steps. "Shut the damn doors!" He was too late. The red dust drifted over the threshold just as Silas reached the porch. It swirled around his boots, glittering like crushed rubies. He held his breath, pulling his bandana up over his nose, and burst into the room. The scene inside was one of jarring normality. Big Mike was behind the bar, polishing a glass. Old Pete was playing the piano. A poker game was in full swing at the center table. "Sheriff?" Big Mike called out, frowning. "What's the rumpus? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Everybody out!" Silas yelled, waving his arms. "Cover your faces! Don't breathe the air!" The room went silent. The piano stopped. The miners looked at him, confused, some half rising from their chairs. "Is this a raid, Silas?" one of them asked, laughing nervously. Then the coughing started. It began at the table nearest the door. A young miner named Thomas bent over, hacking. It was a dry, raspy cough. "You okay, Tom?" his partner asked. Thomas looked up. A trickle of black oil ran from his nose. "I taste pennies," he wheezed. Suddenly, Thomas convulsed. He slammed his hand onto the table to steady himself. But when he tried to pull it away, it wouldn't move. "My hand!" Thomas screamed. "It's stuck!" Silas rushed forward, but stopped as he saw the horror unfold. Thomas's hand hadn't just stuck to the wood. His fingers were fusing together. The skin was turning grey and hard, merging with the wood of the table. The transformation was instant and aggressive. "Help me!" Thomas shrieked, pulling frantically. His wrist snapped with a loud crack, but it didn't bleed. A bundle of wires spilled out of his arm where the bone should have been. Panic detonated in the room. Men scrambled back, overturning chairs and tables, but the red dust was everywhere now, caught in the draft of the moving bodies. It was in their lungs. The piano player, old Pete, started screaming. Silas turned to see him. Pete's hands were still on the keys. He was trying to lift them, but his fingers had elongated, turning into slender metal rods that were driving themselves into the ivory keys. He was becoming part of the instrument. "Get out!" Silas roared, grabbing a man by the collar and shoving him toward the back exit. "Through the kitchen! Go, go!" But the exit was blocked. A miner who had been standing near the back door had frozen mid-step. His legs had fused together into a single, solid pillar of grey iron. He was effectively a barricade, anchored to the floorboards. The sound in the saloon changed. The human screams began to be drowned out by a cacophony of industrial noise. A man at the bar fell to the floor, shaking violently. His skin boiled. Metallic spikes erupted from his spine, tearing through his shirt. He thrashed, and his limbs clanged against the brass footrail like hammers hitting an anvil. Big Mike, the bartender, grabbed a shotgun from under the counter. "Stay back!" he yelled at his own customers. "Stay back, you freaks!" Mike's face was turning purple. He brought the shotgun up, but his finger wouldn't squeeze the trigger. Silas watched in horror as the shotgun seemed to sink into Big Mike's hands. The metal of the gun barrel melted into the flesh of his arms. The wood of the stock fused with his chest. "Silas," Mike groaned, looking down as the weapon became a permanent extension of his body. "What's happening to me?" Mike's mouth opened, and the barrel of the shotgun, now fully integrated into his arm, jerked upward. His body convulsed. A blast went off, shattering the mirror behind the bar. But Mike hadn't pulled the trigger. His body had fired it. The saloon was a slaughterhouse of transformation. It wasn't death. It was something far worse. It was a forced evolution into machinery. Men were fusing with their chairs, with the floor, with each other. Silas backed away toward the front door, his eyes stinging, his lungs burning. He knew he had to get out. He couldn't save them. The air was thick with rust spores. A hand grabbed his ankle. Silas looked down. It was Thomas, the first miner. He was on the floor, dragging himself with his one good arm. His face was gone, replaced by a smooth, featureless mask of grey iron. But he could still speak. The voice came from a speaker-like slit in his throat. "Join the Union!" the thing that was Thomas buzzed. Silas kicked the metal hand away. It felt like kicking a vice. He stumbled backward, falling out through the swinging doors and onto the street, He scrambled in the dirt, gasping for clean air, crawling away from the hell that the Lucky Nugget had become. From inside, the screaming had stopped. It was replaced by a new sound. The sound of 100 pistons firing in unholy unison. The sound of steam hissing. The sound of a factory that processed pain. Silas looked up at the moonless sky. The red dust was rising from the saloon chimney now, pumping into the atmosphere like smoke from a smelter. He stood up, swaying dizzily. He checked his hands. They were trembling, but they were still pink. Still flesh, for now. He looked toward the jailhouse. Doc Miller was watching him from the window, his face pale as death. Silas stumbled toward the jail. "Barricade the town," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Burn it all down." But as he reached the jailhouse steps, he heard a sound that froze him. Clang, clang, clang. It was the church bell, but it wasn't Sunday. And the ringer, Father John, was an old man who couldn't pull the rope that fast. The bell was ringing with a frantic, impossible speed, and the tone was wrong. It didn't sound like brass. It sounded like a scream trapped in metal. Silas turned to look at the church at the end of the street. The heavy oak doors were bulging outward, as if something massive was pushing from the inside. The night was no longer silent. The weeping rust had awakened the town, and now Blackwood was screaming. The Vespers of Iron. The sound of the church bell was no longer a sound, it was a physical assault. It reverberated through the soles of Sheriff Silas Thorne's boots, vibrating up his shins and settling at a dull, throbbing ache in his teeth. Clang! 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 It possessed a wet, heavy quality, lacking the clear, resonant chime of bronze. It sounded like a sledgehammer striking a side of beef wrapped in sheet metal. Silas stood frozen on the steps of the jailhouse, torn between the instinct to barricade himself inside with Doc Miller and the grim duty that had pinned a tin star to his chest for 20 years. The Lucky Nugget saloon behind him was a lost cause, a sealed tomb of steam and screaming metal. But the church was on the edge of town. If the infection had reached there, then there was no perimeter. There was no escape. "Silas!" Doc Miller hissed from the jailhouse window, his face a pale oval in the darkness. "Get inside! The air is getting thicker." "I have to check the church, Doc," Silas shouted back, his voice sounding hollow. "Father John is in there. Maybe there are survivors." "There are no survivors, Silas. Look at the street." Silas looked. The doc was right. The transformation wasn't just affecting flesh anymore. The very town of Blackwood was changing. The dust that had settled on the hitching rails was reacting with the wood, turning the cedar posts into twisted, rusted iron pikes. The water in the horse trough had solidified into a dark, jelly-like sludge that pulsed with a faint bioluminescent orange glow. Pulling his bandana tighter over his nose, Silas stepped off the boardwalk. The ground felt different. The dirt had hardened. It didn't crunch, it clinked. He moved toward the church, a white clapboard building that stood stark against the black sky. But as he drew closer, the white paint seemed to be peeling away, revealing not wood, but dark, riveted steel plates beneath. The stained glass windows were dark, but a flickering reddish light pulsed from within, like the glow of a furnace. The bell continued its frantic tolling. Clang! Splat! Clang! Silas reached the double doors. They were bulging outward, the wood groaning under immense pressure. He tried the handle, but it was hot to the touch, searingly hot. He kicked the door near the lock, once, twice. With a splintering crash, the wood gave way and the door swung open. A blast of hot air hit him, smelling of incense and burning transmission fluid. Silas raised his lantern, and the beam cut through the gloom. He stopped dead, his mind struggling to comprehend the architecture of the nightmare before him. The pews were full. The entire Sunday congregation seemed to be present. Dozens of people sat in rows facing the altar, but they were not sitting on the pews. They had become the pews. Silas walked down the aisle, his gun trembling in his hand. To his left, Mrs. Gable, the town seamstress, was fused to the wood. Her floral dress had hardened into a rigid painted shell. Her arms were merged with the back of the pew in front of her, her fingers elongated into iron scrollwork. She turned her head towards Silas with a grinding screech of ungreased joints. Her face was a smooth silver mask, but her eyes, those weeping copper eyes, were still human enough to convey eternal torment. "See, lass," she buzzed. Her voice came not from her mouth, which was welded shut, but from a slit in her throat that vibrated like a speaker. "Pray for Rust." Silas backed away, gagging. He looked to the right. The Miller family. The children were indistinguishable from the bench they sat on. Their legs had melted into the floor, anchoring them forever. They were silent, their heads bowed in a mockery of prayer, but the tops of their skulls were open, venting small puffs of steam. He forced himself to look at the altar. The cross that hung above the pulpit was no longer wood. It was a chaotic assembly of pistons, gears, and pipes. And crucified upon it was not an effigy of Christ, but a writhing mass of black veins and iron ribs that pulsed with a heartbeat loud enough to hear. Thump hiss, but the bell was still ringing, and it was coming from the tower above the vestibule. Silas ran to the narrow staircase leading to the bell tower. The steps were slick with oil. He climbed, slipping, scrambling, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The sound grew louder, deafening, shaking the fillings in his teeth. He reached the trapdoor at the top and shoved it open. The belfry was open to the night air. The massive iron bell hung in the center, swinging wildly. But there was no rope, and there was no ringer. Silas raised the lantern, and the scream died in his throat before it could be borne. Father John was not ringing the bell. Father John was the bell. The priest's body had been grotesquely distended. His torso was hollowed out and flared at the bottom, forming the shell of the bell itself. His skin was grey iron, thick and reverberating. His arms were stretched upward, fused to the wooden beam above, acting as the hinge. And his head? Father John's head dangled upside down inside his own hollowed-out chest cavity. His neck had elongated into a thick rope-like cable. As the body bell swung back and forth, his head, the clapper, swung with it. Slam! The priest's head struck the iron interior of his own ribcage. Clang! His face was a ruin of smashed bone and metal, flattened by the repeated impacts. But he was still alive. As his head swung past Silas, the one remaining eye opened. It focused on the sheriff. "Forgive me," the head wheezed, right before it smashed into the iron wall of the torso again. Splat clang. Silas fell to his knees, covering his ears. The horror was absolute. It was a desecration of the soul so profound that he felt his own sanity fracturing. "Stop it!" Silas screamed. "Stop it, John!" He raised his Colt Peacemaker. His hand was shaking so badly he had to steady it with the other. He aimed at the cable of flesh that held the swinging head. Bang! The gunshot was lost in the cacophony of the bell, but the bullet found its mark. The sinewy cable snapped. Father John's head detached and fell, tumbling out of the hollow iron body and hitting the floor of the belfry with a wet thud. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was sudden and violent. The hollow iron shell of the priest's body continued to swing slowly, fading into stillness. Silas scrambled backward, away from the severed head on the floor. He needed air. He needed to get out. But as he turned to the trapdoor, a shadow rose from the corner of the tower. It was the choir boy, Timmy, or it had been. The boy was clinging to the wall like a spider. His limbs had been replaced by multi-jointed metallic spikes. His jaw was gone, replaced by a row of vertical metal fangs that dripped black oil. "The anthem is not finished," the creature hissed. It leapt. Silas threw himself backward, falling through the open trapdoor. He tumbled down the stairs, hitting the wooden steps hard, ribs cracking. He landed at the bottom in a heap, the lantern shattering, plunging the stairwell into darkness. He could hear the clack, clack, clack of the metal spikes descending the stairs above him. Silas scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his side, and burst back into the main sanctuary. The congregation turned their heads in unison. 50 silver faces, 50 pairs of weeping copper eyes watching him. "Seize the unbeliever!" they droned together. The sound was like a swarm of locusts. The pews began to shift. The floorboards groaned as the fused monstrosities tried to rip themselves free to get to him. Silas didn't look back. He ran. He sprinted through the nave, dodging the grasping metal claws of Mrs. Gable, leaping over the solidified puddle of the holy water font. He burst through the front doors and out into the cool night air. He didn't stop running until he hit the door of the jailhouse, pounding on it with his fists. "Doc, open up! It's me!" The door flew open, and Doc Miller dragged him inside, slamming the deadbolt home. "Did you find him?" Doc asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you find Father John?" Silas slid down the wall, collapsing onto the floor. He looked at his hands. They were covered in black oil and grey dust. "The church is gone, Doc," Silas whispered, staring at the ceiling. "God has left Blackwood, and something else has moved in." From the darkness outside, a new sound emerged. A low, rhythmic thrumming coming from the mines north of town. It sounded like a massive engine starting up deep underground. The ground beneath the jailhouse floorboards began to vibrate. The town wasn't just dying, it was being repurposed. Blackwood was becoming a factory, and they were the raw materials. The clockwork vermin, the jailhouse was vibrating. It wasn't a tremble, it was a low, resonant frequency that rattled the teeth in Silas's skull. The kerosene lanterns hanging from the ceiling swayed in unison, their shadows dancing like frantic ghosts against the stone walls. Silas sat on the floor, his back against the heavy oak desk, reloading his Colt Peacemaker. His hands were steady now, an unnatural steadiness born of shock. He had seen a man become a bell. He had seen a congregation weld themselves to their pews. The world he knew, the world of laws and men and predictable sunrises, was gone. It had been replaced by a logic of gears and steam. "Do you hear it, Silas?" Doc Miller asked. He was standing by the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. "The rhythm! It's a 4/4 time signature, industrial tempo. It's the mines," Silas grunted, snapping the cylinder of his gun shut. "That stranger, he said they dug too deep. He said they found a chamber of clockwork." "Not found," Doc corrected, his voice distant. "Awakened." Silas looked up. There was something wrong with the doctor's posture. He was standing too straight. His spine looked rigid, like a rod. "Doc, come away from the window. If they see you, they don't see with eyes, Silas," Doc interrupted. "They sense vibration. They sense the heat of your blood, the inefficiency of your biology." Suddenly, a sound came from the floorboards near the potbelly stove. Scritch, scritch, grind. It sounded like rats. But rats didn't make a grinding noise. Rats didn't sound like a file being dragged across a saw blade. "We have company," Silas whispered, raising his gun. A knot in the wooden floorboard exploded upward in a shower of splinters. A dark shape scurried out, moving with terrifying speed. It skittered across the floor and slammed into the leg of the desk. Silas fired. Bang! The bullet struck the creature, flipping it over. But there was no splash of blood. There was a spark, a bright blue-white flash of flint striking steel. Silas leaned forward, the lantern light illuminating the carcass. It was a rat, or at least it had been. Its fur was patchy, falling away to reveal plates of tarnished copper riveted to its skin. Its tail was not a fleshy cord, but a segmented, flexible metal cable that whipped back and forth. But the worst part was the head. The upper jaw had been replaced by a spinning, serrated drill bit. The eyes were tiny glowing diodes of red glass. "Mechanized vermin," Doc Miller said, walking over to inspect it. He didn't look afraid. He looked fascinated. "Scavengers. They're here to clear the debris. That means us, Silas." "There's never just one," Silas said, scrambling to his feet. As if in answer, the floorboards all around them began to bulge. The sound of gnawing filled the room, a deafening chorus of metal teeth chewing through wood. Zzzzt. Crunch. "Get on the desk," Silas yelled, grabbing Doc by the coat and hauling him up onto the sturdy oak surface, just in time. The floor dissolved. Dozens, then hundreds of the clockwork rats poured out from the foundations. They swarmed over the floor like a carpet of living rust. Their drill-bit mouths spun with a high-pitched whine that pierced the ears. They attacked the furniture, the stove, the walls. They were eating the room. "They're consuming the carbon," Doc shouted over the noise. "They need fuel for the furnace." One of the rats leapt, its cable tail acting like a spring. It flew through the air, aiming for Silas's throat. Silas swatted it with the barrel of his gun. It hit the wall with a clang and fell, its gears whirring brokenly. But another one landed on Doc Miller's leg. "Doc, kick it off!" Silas screamed, aiming his gun. Doc didn't kick. He didn't even scream. He simply looked down at the creature gnawing on his shin. The drill bit was tearing through his trouser legs, spinning against his flesh. But there was no blood. Sparks flew. Screesh! The sound of metal on metal rang out. The rat's drill bit shattered against Doc's leg. Silas lowered his gun, his mouth falling open. Doc Miller looked at Silas, a sad, resigned smile on his face. He reached down and pulled the stunned rat off his leg, crushing it in his hand with a grip that crumpled the copper plating like tin foil. "I tried to tell you, Silas," Doc said softly. "I touched the bridle. I was the first one infected." Doc reached up and grabbed the lapel of his coat. He ripped it open, buttons popping and pinging off the floor. Then he tore open his shirt. Silas recoiled. Doc Miller's torso was no longer human. From the neck down, his skin had been replaced by a complex breastplate of brass and iron. Where his heart should have been, a glass window revealed a glowing, pulsing core of green fluid. Pistons pumped rhythmically along his ribs, hissing with every breath. "I am efficient," Doc said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming resonant and booming. "I no longer require sleep. I no longer feel pain. The rust has improved me." "You?" Silas backed away to the edge of the desk, the sea of metal rats snapping at his boots. "You're one of them." "I am the transition," Doc said. He raised his hand. His fingers retracted, sliding back into his wrist, and a long, slender syringe slid out in their place. "Do not resist, Silas. The flesh is weak. It rots. It fails. Iron is eternal." "No!" Silas shouted. He kicked the lantern off the desk. The glass shattered. The kerosene spilled onto the swarm of rats below. The flames roared up instantly. But the rats didn't burn. They absorbed the heat. Their copper shells glowed cherry red, but they didn't stop. If anything, the fire made them faster. "Fire is energy!" Doc roared, stepping toward Silas. "You cannot destroy us with the tools of the old world." Silas didn't think. He reacted. He swung the heavy butt of his pistol and smashed it into Doc Miller's face. The doctor's glasses shattered. The skin of his cheek tore away, revealing a steel cheekbone. Doc stumbled back, the impact jarring his gyroscope. He fell off the desk and into the swarm of burning mechanical rats. The rats didn't distinguish between friend and foe. They swarmed over Doc Miller, their drills spinning, tearing at his brass plating, seeking the green energy fluid inside his chest. "Silas!" Doc screamed, but it wasn't a plea for help. It was a glitching, looping audio file. "Seaside Silas, join the gear grind!" Silas leapt. He jumped from the desk to the top of the iron jail cell block in the corner of the room. He scrambled up the bars, hauling himself onto the roof of the cells, just as the desk he had been standing on collapsed under the weight of the vermin. Below him, the floor was a lake of fire and metal. Doc Miller was gone, buried under a mound of glowing, clicking rats. Silas lay on the top of the cell block, gasping for air. The smoke was thick and oily. Then he heard it. A knocking. It was coming from beneath him. From inside cell 2, the stranger, the pale rider. "Sheriff!" The voice came through the ventilation grate on the roof of the cell. It was clear now, commanding. "Open the door. My incubation is complete." Silas crawled to the edge and looked down through the bars of the cell roof. The stranger was standing in the center of the cell. The kerosene lamp inside was still burning. The man was no longer a man, he was a masterpiece of horror. He stood 7 feet tall now. His duster coat hung in tatters around a body made of black, polished obsidian and chrome. His head was a smooth, elongated dome, featureless save for a single vertical slit that glowed with a blinding white light. He raised a hand, a gauntlet of articulate blades, and pointed at the cell door. "The time of flesh is over," the entity said. "I am the herald of the gear. Open the door, and I will make your death quick. Keep it closed, and I will make you a battery that lasts for 1,000 years." The rats below had stopped eating the desk. They turned their glowing red eyes upward, looking at Silas. They were waiting for a command. Silas looked at the skylight above him. The only way out. It was small, barred, and 20 feet up. But the heat from the fire was rising. The pressure in the room was building. "Go to hell," Silas choked out. The entity in the cell emitted a sound, a low bass note that vibrated the very stones of the wall. Hum. The lock on the cell door shattered. The iron bars bent outward like cooked spaghetti. The herald stepped out into the inferno of the office. The rats parted like a sea before him. He looked up at Silas, his single eye burning. "Hell!" The herald's voice filled Silas's mind. "We have brought hell to the surface, Sheriff, and we have paved it with iron." The sky of gears. The skylight was small, grimy, and barred with iron. But the iron of the jailhouse roof had not yet been touched by the herald's corruption. It was still rusted, brittle pig iron from the old foundry. Silas stood on top of the cell block, the heat from the floor below baking the soles of his boots. The smoke was a choking black column rising around him, stinging his eyes until he was blinded by tears. Below, the mechanical voice of the herald boomed, vibrating the very air. "Ascension is inevitable, Sheriff. Why cling to the meat?" Silas didn't answer. He wrapped his duster around his arm and punched the glass of the skylight. It shattered, raining shards down into the inferno. He reached up, grabbed the hot iron bars, and pulled. He screamed as the metal burned his palms, but adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. He braced his boots against the stone wall and heaved. With a groan of protesting metal, the old mortar gave way. The entire frame of the skylight ripped loose from the roof. Silas shoved it aside and hauled himself up, scrambling out into the night air just as the jailhouse floor below finally collapsed into the basement, taking the swarm of mechanical rats with it. He rolled onto the tar-papered roof of the sheriff's office and lay there for a moment, coughing up black soot. The air up here was cooler, but it wasn't fresh. It smelled of ozone, burning hair, and the sharp electric tang of a thunderstorm that never breaks. Silas pushed himself up to his knees and looked out over Blackwood. His breath caught in his throat, the scream that had been building in his chest since he saw the stranger's horse died there, suffocated by the sheer magnitude of the transformation. Blackwood was no longer a town. It was a single sprawling organism. From his vantage point, Silas could see the rooftops of Main Street, but the streets themselves were gone. In their place was a moving floor, a massive, undulating conveyor belt made of interlocking stone and iron plates. It moved slowly, grinding toward the north, toward the mines. And on this conveyor belt were the people. Hundreds of figures stood rigid on the moving street. They were statues of grey iron, their arms fused to their sides, their heads facing forward. They were being transported like products on an assembly line. But the buildings were alive. The general store had grown. Its wooden walls had expanded, pulsing like lungs. Massive pipes erupted from its windows, snaking across the alleyway to plunge into the side of the livery stable. A thick, viscous black fluid pumped through these pipes, translucent enough to see the shapes of things swimming inside. The town was connected. A web of cables, wires, and wet, fleshy tubes strung from rooftop to rooftop, binding every structure together into a unified circuit. "It's a motherboard," Silas whispered, though he didn't know the word. He only knew it looked like the inside of a watch, but grown to the size of a city and made of meat and hate. Suddenly, a sound like tearing canvas came from the edge of the roof behind him. Silas spun around, drawing his Colt. A hand, huge, black, and made of polished chrome blades, slammed onto the edge of the roof. The tar paper sizzled where the fingers touched it. The Herald. He was climbing the outside of the building. He didn't climb like a man. He moved with the jerky staccato rhythm of an insect. Silas didn't wait to see the face. He turned and ran. He sprinted across the roof of the jailhouse, aiming for the narrow gap between it and the adjacent building, the Blackwood Bank. The gap was 6 feet wide. A drop of 2 stories into the grinding machinery of the alleyway below. Silas didn't hesitate. He leaped. For a second, he was airborne, his arms flailing. He hit the slanted roof of the bank hard, sliding down the shingles. He clawed at the wood, splinters driving under his fingernails, and managed to stop himself just before he slid off the edge. He looked back. The herald stood on the roof of the jailhouse. He was silhouetted against the fire rising from the collapsed building. He didn't jump. He simply stepped off the edge, floating for a second before sleek metallic wings, like those of a dragonfly, but made of razor-thin steel, unfolded from his back with a snick-snick sound. They buzzed, blurring into invisibility, and the herald glided across the gap, landing silently on the bank roof 10 feet from Silas. "You run with the desperation of a prey animal," the herald said. His voice didn't travel through the air. It resonated directly inside Silas's skull. "It is inefficient." Silas fired. Bang, bang, bang. 3 bullets struck the herald's chest. They sparked and ricocheted, whining off into the night. The herald didn't even flinch. "Lead is soft," the herald mocked. He raised his arm, and a coil of wire shot from his wrist like a whip. Silas rolled to the left. The wire cracked against the shingles where his head had been a second ago, slicing through the wood and the support beams beneath like a hot knife through butter. Silas scrambled up the slope of the roof, his boots slipping. He needed to get higher. The hotel, the Grandview Hotel, was the tallest building in town, 3 stories high. If he could get to the water tower on its roof. He reached the peak of the bank roof and looked down the other side. A wooden walkway connected the bank to the hotel's second-floor balcony, but the walkway was twisting. As Silas watched, the wood groaned and warped, the railings turning into ribs, the floorboards turning into a spine. He ran across it anyway. The structure shuddered under his weight. It felt soft, spongy. He was running across a bridge of living tissue that was rapidly calcifying into bone. He crashed onto the hotel balcony and kicked the door in. The hallway of the hotel was dark, but it wasn't empty. Standing in the corridor were the maids, 3 of them. They wore their starched uniforms, but their heads were gone. In their place were large glowing vacuum tubes, flickering with amber light. Their hands had been replaced by feather dusters that spun with the force of industrial sanders. They turned toward him. The vacuum tubes hummed louder. "Guests are restricted to the lobby," they droned in unison. Silas didn't fight. He shoulder-checked the nearest door, bursting into a guest room. He ran to the window and looked out. The train station. It was at the south end of town, and there, sitting on the tracks, was a train. But it wasn't the midnight supply train. It was a monstrosity. The locomotive was massive, twice the size of a Union Pacific engine. It was shaped like a skull, made of black iron. Smoke poured from its nostrils. And behind it, the cars were not boxcars. They were cages, massive, barred cages, and they were empty. Waiting. "They're shipping us out," Silas realized. "They're not just changing us, they're harvesting us." The door to the room splintered. The herald was hacking through it with his blade arm. Silas looked up. The water tower was directly above this room on the roof. An exterior maintenance ladder ran up the side of the wall just outside the window. He smashed the window with a chair and climbed out onto the ledge. The wind was howling now, carrying the screams of the town. He grabbed the rusty rungs of the ladder and began to climb. His shoulder burned where he had landed on it earlier. His lungs felt full of dust. He reached the roof of the hotel. He was at the highest point in Blackwood. He looked up at the sky, hoping to see the stars, hoping to see God. But there was no sky. The clouds had lowered. They had solidified. A ceiling of grey, swirling fog hung just 100 feet above the town. And in the center of this ceiling, where the moon should have been, was a giant, unblinking eye. It was a mechanical eye, easily 50 feet wide. Its iris was a shutter mechanism, opening and closing, focusing a beam of pale, sickly light down onto the town. The beam was sweeping the streets. Scanning. "The overseer," Silas whispered, his sanity teetering on the edge of the abyss. The beam swept over the hotel roof. It hit Silas. He felt a sensation of intense cold. His skin prickled. The hairs on his arms stood up. "Specimen identified!" A voice boomed from the sky itself. It was deafening. "Silas Thorne! Designation resistant. Priority. Assimilate." The herald climbed over the parapet of the roof. He stood under the gaze of the giant eye, his chrome body gleaming. "The eye has seen you, Silas," the herald said, extending both blade arms. "There is nowhere left to hide. The architect is watching." Silas backed up until his back hit the wooden legs of the water tower. He was trapped. The herald in front of him, the drop to the mechanical street on all sides, the giant eye above. But Silas Thorne was a lawman. And he had one bullet left. He didn't aim at the herald. The bullets were useless against him. He looked at the water tower above him. It was old, the wood was rotting, and it was full of water, thousands of gallons of water. "You said water is the carrier," Silas shouted over the wind. The herald paused, tilting his head. "Affirmative. The water contains the nanites, the eggs of the iron blight." "Then let's have a drink," Silas snarled. He turned his gun upward and fired his last bullet. Not at the herald. At the rusty iron band holding the bottom of the water tower together. Ping! The band snapped. The pressure did the rest. The bottom of the tank blew out with the force of a tidal wave. Thousands of gallons of water, infected, blight-ridden water, crashed down onto the roof. Silas took a deep breath and let the flood take him. The gullet of the machine. The fall was a blur of churning water and debris. Silas didn't feel the impact when he hit the street below. The flood he had unleashed from the water tower cushioned him, acting as a chaotic, violent slide. He was tumbled, tossed, and rolled along the moving pavement of Main Street, choking on mouthfuls of the very liquid he had feared most. The water was cold, but as it slid down his throat, it burned like acid. It tasted of sulfur, copper, and something electrically charged, like licking a battery terminal. He slammed into a solid object and gasped for air, dragging himself up. He was waist-deep in the sludge, clinging to the iron post of what used to be a hitching rail. The street was moving. The entire road surface was a series of interlocking steel plates, grinding slowly but inexorably toward the south, toward the train station. The floodwater was draining away through grates between the plates, sucking down into the darkness below with a wet, slurping sound. Silas coughed, retching violently. He spat out black bile. "No," he rasped, wiping his mouth. His hand came away smeared with a glittering, reddish residue. No, no, no! He felt it immediately. A heaviness in his stomach. A fluttering sensation like a moth trapped in his belly. Then a sharp, rhythmic pinch. Tick, it was inside him. The incubation had begun. He looked around. The flood had knocked down some of the statues, the frozen townspeople being transported on the conveyor belt. Mrs. Higgins, the schoolteacher, was lying on her side a few feet away. Her iron shell had cracked open from the fall. Silas crawled over to her. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't control. Inside the shell of Mrs. Higgins, there were no organs. There was no blood. Her hollow chest cavity was filled with tightly wound brass springs and a complex arrangement of gyroscopes that spun silently. Her human life had been completely scooped out, replaced by clockwork imitation. "Attention!" a voice boomed from the speaker throat of the fallen teacher. "Unit 42 damaged, requesting recycling." Silas scrambled back, horrified. He couldn't stay on the street. The conveyor belt was carrying everyone to the train, to the cages. He had to go down. Down was the only direction the overseer's eye couldn't see. He spotted a storm drain near the sidewalk. The grate had been blown loose by the water pressure. It was a gaping black maw, exhaling steam that smelled of rendered fat and oil. Silas slid toward it. The moving street tried to carry him past, but he jammed his boot into a gap in the plates and lunged, grabbing the lip of the drain. He pulled himself over the edge and dropped into the darkness. He landed on a metal catwalk 10 feet down. The air here was sweltering, humid and thick with the roar of machinery. He was under the town. If the surface was the skin of the beast, this was its digestive system. Huge pistons, the size of tree trunks, hammered up and down in the gloom, driving the conveyor belt above. Pipes hissed, leaking green steam. And everywhere there was the sound of chewing. Silas stood up, clutching his ribs. They were broken. He could feel the jagged ends grinding together. But the pain was distant, dull, too dull. He looked at his hand, the one he had used to grab the drain. The skin on his knuckles was graying. He tried to make a fist. His fingers moved with a jerky, ratcheting motion. Click, click, clench. "I don't have much time," he whispered. He began to walk along the catwalk, moving deeper into the underbelly of Blackwood. He needed to find the source. The stranger had said something about a chamber of clockwork, deep in the mines. If there was a way to stop this, to kill the signal controlling the hive, it had to be there. The catwalk led him into a vast circular chamber directly beneath the town square. Silas stopped, hiding behind a support pillar. In the center of the chamber was a pool, but it wasn't water. It was a vat of molten silver and mercury, bubbling and frothing. Above the vat, suspended by chains, were bodies. They were the miners who had been in the saloon. Silas watched in mute horror as a mechanical claw lowered a struggling man. It was Big Mike, the bartender, into the vat. Mike screamed, but the sound was cut short as he was submerged. The liquid metal hissed. Moments later, The claw raised him up. Mike was gone. In his place was a perfect silver-plated replica. But this replica wasn't statue still. It was thrashing. Wires were being threaded into its spine by spider-like machines that descended from the ceiling. "Assembly complete," a mechanical voice announced. "Deploy to Sector 7. Silas turned away, bile rising in his throat again. He couldn't save them. They were already raw material. He spotted a maintenance tunnel marked Mineshaft Access, Level 4. It was unguarded. The machines didn't expect a rat to be loose in the walls. He sprinted for the tunnel, his boots clanging on the metal grating. As he ran, the ticking in his stomach got louder. It was syncing with the rhythm of his footsteps. Step-tick, step-tick. He reached the tunnel entrance and shoved the heavy door open. It slammed shut behind him, cutting off the roar of the assembly chamber. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. The tunnel was hewn from rock, not metal, held up by old wooden beams that were slowly turning to iron. Silas leaned against the wall to catch his breath. He pulled his shirt up to check his stomach. A bruise was forming around his navel, a dark purple bruise in the shape of a gear. And under the skin, something was pushing out. A small, sharp point. He touched it. It was hard. "Get it out," he hissed to himself. He drew his knife. The blade was dull, but it would work. He bit down on his leather belt to stifle the scream. He pressed the knife tip into the center of the bruise and sliced. There was no pain. That was the scariest part. The nerve endings were dead. The skin parted like wet cardboard. Silas dug the knife in, prying at the object. With a wet suction sound, he popped it out. It fell onto the dusty floor. It wasn't a tumor. It was a small brass cog, about the size of a coin. It was spinning. Even outside his body, covered in his dark, oily blood, it was spinning. And in the hole it left in his stomach, Silas could see more of them. A nest of tiny gears, meshing together, replacing his intestines loop by loop. He dropped the knife. He couldn't cut them all out. He was becoming a clock. "Help!" The voice was faint. It came from further down the tunnel. Silas froze. He picked up his knife, wiped it on his pants, and grabbed his lantern, which miraculously was still working, though the glass was cracked. "Who's there?" he called out. "Silas!" The voice was familiar. Heartbreakingly familiar. "Sarah," Silas whispered. "His wife." Sarah had died 3 years ago. Of fever. He had buried her himself in the cemetery on the hill. "Silas, it's cold down here." He began to run. He ignored the ticking in his gut. He ignored the stiffness in his legs. He ran toward the voice. The tunnel opened into a small cavern. In the center, sitting on a pile of rubble, was a woman. She wore the blue dress she had been buried in. Her hair was loose, cascading over her shoulders. Her back was to him. "Sarah!" Silas stepped closer, tears stinging his eyes. "How is this possible? I buried you." "The earth gave me back, Silas," she said. Her voice was sweet, melodic. "The roots of the iron went deep. They found me." She stood up and turned around. Silas screamed. Her face was Sarah's. Her eyes were blue. Her skin was pale and soft. She looked exactly as she had the day she died. but her chest was open. Her ribs had been pulled back like the shutters of a window. Inside her chest cavity, there were no lungs, no heart. There was a birdcage, a small, ornate golden birdcage welded to her spine. And inside the cage, a mechanical canary made of razor blades was hopping from perch to perch, singing with Sarah's voice. "Do you like my song, Silas?" the canary sang, its beak snapping open and closed. "The architect made it just for you, to lure the old wolf into the trap." The woman's body, the puppet carrying the cage, smiled. "Join us, husband. The grave is so lonely, but the machine is a family." Silas raised his gun. His hand was shaking uncontrollably. "You're not Sarah," he sobbed. "You're a thing. You're just a thing." "I am better," the canary screeched, the voice distorting into static. "I am eternal. Put down the weapon, meat sack." Sarah's arms suddenly elongated. The skin split, revealing hydraulic pistons. She lunged at him, her fingers turning into long, needle-like syringes. Silas fired. He didn't aim for the head. He aimed for the cage. Bang! The bullet struck the golden cage. The mechanical canary exploded in a shower of springs and gears. The woman's body instantly went limp. It collapsed like a marionette whose strings had been cut, falling into a heap of dust and old bones. The blue dress fluttered to the ground, empty. Silas stood over the remains, his chest heaving. He was sobbing, dry, hacking sobs that hurt his throat. "They're using the dead," he whispered. "They're recycling the graveyards." He looked past the pile of bones. Behind where the Sarah thing had been sitting, there was a heavy iron door. It was marked with a symbol he had never seen before, a cog with an eye in the center. The door was slightly ajar, and from the crack, a brilliant, blinding purple light was spilling out. And a sound, not ticking, not grinding, singing. A choir of thousands, singing in perfect mathematical harmony. Silas wiped his eyes. He reloaded his gun with his shaking grey hands. He had one bullet left in the cylinder, and a handful in his pocket. He stepped over the remains of his wife's memory and pushed the door open. He had found the church of the new God. The Cathedral of the Mainspring. Silas Thorne pushed the heavy iron door open and stepped into the belly of the beast. He had expected a cave, or perhaps a mine shaft widened by pickaxes. He had not expected a cathedral of impossible geometry. The chamber was vast, a hollowed-out geode beneath the earth. But instead of crystals, the walls were lined with millions of interlocking brass gears. They stretched up into the darkness, a vertical horizon of teeth and oil. The ceiling was lost in shadow, from which hung heavy chains as thick as a man's torso. And in the center of this spinning, grinding sanctum sat the architect. It was a monstrosity of glass and copper, suspended over a bubbling vat of molten mercury. It resembled a spider, but its legs were hydraulic pistons that twitched with calculated precision. Its body was a transparent sphere, and floating inside, bathed in a luminescent green nutrient bath, was not a single brain, but a cluster. Dozens of human brains, wired together with gold filaments, pulsing in unison. "Welcome, Sheriff," the architect spoke. The voice did not come from a mouth. It resonated from the very vibrations of the gears in the walls. It was a cold, polyphonic sound, like a choir of dead men speaking through a radio. "You are 4 minutes and 12 seconds late. This deviates from the efficiency model." Silas took a step forward, his knees buckling. The ticking in his stomach was deafening here, syncing with the colossal heartbeat of the room. "What is this?" Silas screamed, raising his gun. His voice cracked, sounding small and pathetic against the roar of the machine. "What have you done to my town?" The cluster of brains inside the architect shifted, bubbles rising in the green fluid. "Your town?" The architect chuckled, a sound like grinding stones. "Blackwood was never yours, Sheriff. It was a petri dish, an incubator. We tested the fragility of calcium and carbon, and we improved it with steel and silicon." Silas looked around. Along the walls, nestled in alcoves between the massive cogs, were people, or what used to be people. They were encased in iron shells, their mouths welded open, tubes running down their throats. They were singing. That sound, the choir Silas had heard from the tunnel, was coming from them. But they weren't singing words. They were emitting a constant resonant frequency, a sonic power source that kept the gears turning. "They are euphoric," the architect said, noting Silas's horror. "They no longer hunger. They no longer fear death. They are components of the great machine. They are eternal. They are dead," Silas roared. He leveled his cult peacemaker at the glass sphere and squeezed the trigger. Click! The hammer didn't fall. Silas looked down at his hand. He gasped. His right hand was no longer a hand holding a gun. The flesh of his fingers had melted, fusing with the steel of the revolver. The grip of the Colt had merged with his palm. The trigger was welded to his finger. His arm and the weapon were now a single, continuous piece of biomechanical hardware. "The weapon is now an extension of the self," the architect said soothingly. "Your assimilation is 78% complete, Silas. Soon the illogical fear you feel would be replaced by the purity of mathematics." Silas tried to drop the gun, but he couldn't. It was his bone now. Pain shot up his arm. Not the sharp pain of a cut, but the deep, dull ache of structural realignment. His mind felt foggy. Equations were flashing before his eyes. Trajectories, probabilities. I won't serve you," Silas gritted out. He reached into his pocket with his left hand, his human hand, and pulled out his last few bullets. "Why resist?" The architect lowered itself on its piston legs, bringing the glass sphere closer to Silas. A large, shutter-like camera lens on its front zoomed in and out, focusing on him. "Look at the surface world. Chaos, war, decay. We offer order. We offer peace." "The train," Silas realized, his mind fighting through the fog. "You're sending the train east." "Correct," the architect confirmed. "To New York, to London. Once the vector reaches the population centers, the global rust will begin. The world will become a clockwork utopia, just like this room." Silas looked up. He couldn't shoot the architect. The glass was inches thick, bulletproof, and his right hand was frozen fused. But Silas Thorne was a gambler, and he saw something the architect, in its obsession with perfection, had missed. High above, where the massive chains holding the architect were anchored to the ceiling, there was a single corroded bolt. An old iron spike from the original mine shaft, dating back 50 years. It was rusted. Not the weeping, magical rust of the blight, but simple, honest, natural oxidation. It was weak. "My calculations indicate," the architect droned, "that your chance of damaging me is 0.1%. "I never was good at math," Silas snarled. He didn't try to pull the trigger with his fused finger. He used his left thumb. He reached over, grabbed the hammer of the gun that was now part of his right arm, and cranked it back. It felt like snapping his own wrist. He aimed, not at the architect, but at the ceiling, at the rusty bolt. "Calculated error," the architect dismissed. Silas let the hammer drop. Bang! The gunshot echoed like a cannon blast in the enclosed space. The bullet whined through the air and struck the rusted iron spike. For a second, nothing happened. Then a groan, a sound like a dying whale. Screech! The bolt sheared. The chain snapped. Gravity, the one law the architect couldn't rewrite, took over. The massive, multi-ton body of the spider machine plummeted. "Error! Critical failure!" the architect shrieked, its voice glitching into static. It fell into the vat of molten mercury. Splash! The chamber exploded in a wave of silver liquid and steam. The architect thrashed in the boiling metal, its hydraulic legs smashing against the sides of the vat, shattering the glass sphere. The green fluid mixed with the mercury. The brains inside sizzled and boiled. Sparks showered down like rain. The gears in the walls ground to a halt, then started spinning backward, screeching in protest. The human choir in the walls stopped their harmonic humming and began to scream. A collective wail of waking up from a nightmare into hell. The shock wave knocked Silas flat. He lay on the metal floor, gasping. His right side was numb. He looked down. His right leg had turned completely to iron. He couldn't move it. "It's not over," he whispered, dragging himself toward the exit with his one good arm. The architect was destroying itself in the pit, but the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the factory hadn't stopped. The conveyor belt was still moving. The train was still waiting. Silas crawled back into the tunnel. His vision was shifting. He was starting to see in infrared. The world was turning into a grid of heat signatures. He was dying, or rather Silas Thorne was ending, and something else was beginning. But he had one last duty to perform. He had to catch a train. The iron horse's breath. The climb back to the surface was an exercise in agony that Silas Thorne, or the entity that was rapidly consuming him, registered only as structural stress data. He dragged himself up the maintenance shaft, his human left hand bleeding and raw, slipping on the oily rungs. His right side, however, moved with terrifying efficiency. The iron leg that had replaced his flesh drove him upward like a piston, denting the metal ladder with every step. Clang, clang, clang. His vision was glitching. The darkness of the tunnel was overlaid with a translucent red grid. Text scrolled rapidly in the corner of his eye, projected directly onto his retina by the new optical nerves growing behind his sockets. System alert. Central processor. Architect offline. Rerouting command to Locomotive Alpha. Priority. Departure imminent. Organic decay. Detected in left hemisphere. Purge recommended. Shut up, Silas growled, shaking his head. The voice in his head wasn't auditory. It was a stream of data. He bit his tongue just to feel the pain, to remind himself that he was still a man. The copper taste of blood was grounding. It was the only human thing left in a world of oil and steam. He reached the grate at the top of the shaft and punched it. His fused gun arm struck the metal. The grate didn't just open, it flew off its hinges, spinning into the night. Silas pulled himself out and stood up. He was at the south end of town, directly overlooking the train station. The transformation of the landscape was complete. The conveyor belt street that carried the frozen iron-shell townspeople ended here. It fed into a massive, gaping hopper, a funnel made of riveted steel plates that led down to the station platform. And there it sat. The train. It was a monstrosity that defied engineering. The locomotive was the size of a cathedral, a sleek black bullet of iron that seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't sit on wheels. It hovered inches above the glowing, magnetic rails, suspended by a humming field of energy. The engine breathed. Massive vents on its side opened and closed like gills, exhaling clouds of green sulphurous steam. The front of the train was shaped like a skull, but not a human one. It was a cow skull, a twisted homage to the cattle drives of the Old West, but forged in nightmare metal. Its eyes were twin furnaces, burning with a white-hot intensity that scorched the air. "It's alive," Silas whispered. The data scroll in his vision identified it. Unit, Leviathan. Class, Vector Transport. Destination, Eastern Seaboard. Silas watched as the hopper deposited the people of Blackwood onto the flatbed cars behind the engine. Mechanical arms, suspended from cranes, grabbed the frozen statues of Mrs. Higgins, Old Pete, and the others. They were stacked like cordwood, welded into place. They weren't passengers, they were the cargo. And then Silas saw the fuel. Near the tender car, a group of workers, hulking figures with sledgehammers for hands, were shoveling something into the engine's furnace. It wasn't coal. It was the failures. The bodies that hadn't survived the transformation. The piles of bones and twisted metal Silas had seen in the tunnels. The Leviathan ran on the recycled dead. "No more," Silas said. He tried to raise his left hand to wipe the sweat from his brow, but his arm felt heavy. He looked down. His left fingertips were turning grey. The rust was spreading. He had minutes, maybe less, before the programming took over completely. He began to run toward the platform. He didn't run like a human anymore. He ran with a loping mechanical stride, his iron leg tearing up the earth, his speed impossible for a mortal man. He covered the 100 yards to the station in seconds. A perimeter guard spotted him. It was a creature that used to be the station master. Its lower body had been replaced by a set of tank treads. Its upper body was a turret, wielding a heavy rivet gun. "Unauthorized entity," the station master blared. "Halt for disassembly." It fired. Red-hot rivets, large as railroad spikes, streaked through the air. Silas didn't dodge. He didn't have to. His HUD, heads-up display, highlighted the trajectory of the projectiles in bright yellow lines before they even arrived. Threat analysis. Probability of impact 99%. Evasive maneuver. Engaged. Silas's body moved before his brain issued the command. He twisted mid-stride, the rivets whizzing past his ear, the heat searing his cheek. He raised his right arm, his gun arm. He didn't need to aim. The targeting reticle in his eye locked onto the tank tread of the station master. It turned red. Bang! The shot was precise. It hit the drive wheel of the tread. The metal shattered. The station master spun out of control, its turret flailing. Silas didn't stop. He vaulted over the railing of the platform, landing on the metal deck with a heavy xi-lang. He was 10 cars back from the engine. Between him and the locomotive was a sea of loading drones, guards, and the endless stacks of his frozen neighbors. "I'm coming for you," Silas snarled at the engine. The Leviathan seemed to hear him. The train let out a whistle, not a high-pitched shriek, but a low, bone-shaking roar that sounded like a tectonic plate shifting. "Hoo! The train began to move. "No!" Silas sprinted along the flatbed car. A drone, a flying sphere with buzzsaws, swooped down. Silas backhanded it with his iron fist, shattering it mid-air. He jumped the gap between the cars, landing on the next one. The train was picking up speed. The magnetic rails hummed louder, the pitch rising to a scream. Suddenly, the door to the car in front of him slid open. Out stepped the conductor. He was tall, impossibly thin, wearing a pristine uniform that was actually part of his skin. His face was a smooth porcelain mask with no features, no eyes, no nose, only a single vertical speaker grill for a mouth. He held a pocket watch, but the watch was fused to his palm, its chain running directly into his wrist veins. "Ticket, please," the conductor said. His voice was silky, polite, and utterly terrifying. "I'm riding for free," Silas yelled, raising his gun arm. The conductor tilted his head. "We do not accept vagrants, only raw materials." The conductor flicked his wrist. The pocket watch opened. A beam of distorted gravity shot out from the watch face. It hit Silas like a physical wall. He was lifted off his feet and slammed backward, pinned against the stack of iron statues. The pressure was immense. He could feel his remaining human ribs cracking. Warning: structural integrity critical. Gravity well detected. "You are obsolete, Sheriff," the conductor said, walking slowly toward him. His boots clicking on the metal floor. "The architect was a prototype. I'm the production model. I am the schedule, and the schedule cannot be delayed." Silas struggled against the invisible force. He couldn't move his arms, he couldn't breathe, but he could see. His HUD was analyzing the conductor. Target: Gravity modulator, pocket watch. Weakness, crystal oscillator exposed, chance of success. 2%. 2%! Silas gritted his teeth, blood leaking from his nose. I'll take it. He couldn't raise his arm. The gravity was pinning it down, but he could change the shape of his arm. The architect had said his evolution was accelerating. Silas focused on his right hand, the gun. He didn't try to move it, he tried to grow it. Concentrate on the iron. Feel the rust. Come on, he strained. With a sickening sound of stretching metal, the barrel of his Colt extended. It grew longer, rifling, spiraling out like a growing vine. It stretched 6 inches, 12 inches. The conductor didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying the torture. Any last words before you're processed into fuel? The extended barrel of Silas's gun was now pointing at an upward angle, not at the conductor's head, but at the watch in his hand. Yeah, Silas wheezed. Your train is late. He fired. The bullet traveled up the elongated barrel and exited with a flash of blue flame. It struck the face of the pocket watch. Crack! The crystal shattered. The gravity beam collapsed instantly. Silas fell to the floor, gasping. The conductor stared at his broken watch. For the first time, the smooth porcelain mask showed emotion, a ripple of static fear. This is unscheduled. Silas didn't give him a second chance. He lunged forward, his iron leg propelling him like a missile. He tackled the conductor, driving him off the edge of the speeding train. They tumbled through the air. Silas reached out with his left hand, his human hand, and grabbed the railing of the train car. His grip slipped, his fingernails tearing, but he held on. The conductor fell. He hit the magnetic rail below. Zap! The energy field vaporized him instantly. A cloud of blue ozone was all that remained of the schedule. Silas hauled himself back onto the train. He was exhausted. His HUD was flashing red warnings. Battery low. Organic failure at 90%. The train was moving fast now, blurring through the desert night. The lights of Blackwood were fading behind him. He was on board. He was heading east, but he wasn't in the engine yet. The Leviathan was ahead, a fortress of iron and fire. And inside it, the heart of the plague was beating. Silas stood up on the swaying car. The wind whipped his duster, now half merged with his back, around him. One-way trip, he said to the darkness. He began to walk toward the front of the train, toward the skull, toward the end of the line. The furnace of lost souls. Silas Thorne stood on the edge of the tender car, staring at the back of the massive locomotive. The heat radiating from it was intense, smelling of burnt hair and ozone. He jumped down into the fuel hopper. He expected to land on coal. Instead, his boots crunched on something brittle and pale. He looked down. The hopper wasn't filled with coal. It was filled with bricks made of crushed bone, teeth, and melted belt buckles. "Recycling," Silas whispered, a wave of nausea hitting him. The machine wasn't just killing the townspeople. It was using their remains to fuel the journey to the next victims. He kicked the heavy iron door of the furnace room open. The room inside was a nightmare of fire and noise. Massive furnaces roared on both sides, and tending the fires were the stokers. These were hulking creatures, fused permanently into thick lead aprons. Their heads were smooth domes with exhaust pipes sticking out of the top. Their hands had been replaced by massive, rusted shovels. "Intruder!" one stoker buzzed. "Unauthorized biological material." It swung its shovel hand at Silas. Silas dodged, the heavy iron scoop missing his head by inches and sparking against the wall. Combat mode engaged. Silas didn't fight like a man anymore. His HUD, vision system, showed him the weak points. He punched the stoker's knee joint with his iron fist. Crack! The leg snapped backward. As the creature fell, Silas brought his heavy gun arm down on its head, flattening the exhaust pipe. He fought his way through the furnace room, destroying the guards, leaving a trail of oil and sparks. He reached the narrow corridor at the front, leading to the engine's brain. The corridor was disgusting. The walls were pulsing. Pipes looked like veins. It felt like walking inside a giant metal intestine. Finally, he reached the brainstem. It was a circular room with a glass floor. Beneath the glass, the tracks rushed by at a blurring speed. In the center of the room hung the pilot. The pilot was a torso with no legs, suspended by thick black cables. Its face had been peeled away to reveal a chrome skull. Its eyes glowed with blinding white light. "Silas Thorne!" the pilot's voice boomed from the walls. "You are a flawed component. Stop the train!" Silas yelled, aiming his gun arm. "Impossible!" the pilot replied. "We will reach Kansas City in 20 minutes. The infection will spread. The continent will hatch." Silas fired. Bang! The bullet hit an invisible energy shield around the pilot and disintegrated. "Kinetic weapons are useless," the pilot laughed, a sound like grinding gears. Cables shot out from the pilot's back, grabbing Silas. They wrapped around his throat and his human leg, lifting him into the air. Silas choked. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't shoot through the shield. But he remembered what the architect had said. "You are a battery." Silas closed his eyes. He focused on the ticking gears in his own stomach. He focused on the nuclear-like battery in his chest. "Let's see if you can handle a power surge," Silas choked out. He grabbed the cables holding him with his iron hand. He didn't try to break them. He pushed his own energy into them. Discharging capacitors. A massive arc of blue lightning exploded from Silas's body. It traveled up the cables, bypassed the shield, and slammed directly into the pilot's spine. The pilot screamed, "Strut!" The chrome skull exploded. The cables went limp, dropping Silas to the glass floor. "Warning!" the train's computer announced. "Pilot offline. Manual override required." The holographic map in the room flickered and died. The brain was dead. But the train didn't slow down. Silas dragged himself up. His right arm, his gun arm, was smoking. It was fused into a solid lump of useless metal. He had burned it out with the energy blast. "It's not stopping," Silas realized. "The brain is dead, but the heart is still beating." He looked at the heavy door at the front of the room. It was marked Engine Core. He had to go in there. He had to destroy the power source itself. Silas limped toward the door. He was broken, burnt, and half dead. But he was the only thing standing between the world and the Iron Blight. The altar of the Iron Heart. Silas Thorne dragged his ruined body through the blast door. The heat inside the engine core was absolute. It wasn't just hot. It was an environment where biology was forbidden. The air shimmered with radiation and magnetic distortion, stripping the moisture from Silas's remaining human eye instantly. He fell to his knees. His iron leg was glowing a dull cherry red. His human leg was charred, the leather of his boots smoking. "Warning!" his internal system rasped, text scrolling frantically across his vision. "Internal temperature critical. Meltdown in 30 seconds." Silas looked up. In the center of the spherical room, suspended by massive magnetic coils, was the heart. It was a spinning singularity of the Iron Blight, a ball of compressed green energy swirling with liquid mercury. It pulsed like a living organ, beating with a rhythm that shook the floor plates. Thump, hiss, thump, hiss. This was the source. This was the seed that would be planted in the earth of Kansas City to infect the world. "Beautiful, in a hateful way," Silas whispered. His voice box was damaged. He sounded like a radio tuned between stations. He tried to stand, but his fused, slagged right arm dragged him down. It was dead weight. A useless lump of metal. He looked around for a control panel, a brake, anything, but there were no controls here. This room wasn't meant for operators, it was a reactor. The train shuddered violently. Through the walls, Silas could hear the screech of the wheels. "Destination reached in 10 minutes, the automated voice of the train announced. "Prepare for dispersion." Silas crawled toward the heart. Every inch was torture. His human skin was blistering, peeling away to reveal the grey, hard mesh underneath. He was shedding his humanity like a snake shedding skin. He reached the edge of the pit directly below the spinning heart. "I have no bullets," Silas said to the roaring energy. "I have no hands left to strangle you." He looked at his reflection in the polished chrome of the pit's edge. He didn't see a monster. He saw a tired man who had lived too long in a hard world. He remembered Sarah. Not the monster in the mine, but the real Sarah. He remembered the smell of rain on sagebrush. He remembered the taste of cheap whiskey. "The architect said I was a battery," Silas muttered. A realization dawned on him. His body, the half that was machine, was powered by the same energy as the Blight. But his soul, his will, that was something else. That was the volatile element. If he introduced his corrupted, unstable energy core directly into the perfection of the train's heart, the feedback loop wouldn't just stop the engine, it would obliterate it. He had to become the bullet. "System," Silas thought, interfacing with his own HUD. "Disable safety limiters. Reroute all auxiliary power to the chest capacitor." "Warning. This action is fatal. Confirm. Confirm," Silas said. A high-pitched whine started in his chest. The green glow behind his ribs brightened, turning blinding white. He felt a surge of power, agony, and ecstasy mixed together. He stood up. The pain vanished. He was pure energy now. He stepped onto the magnetic railing. The spinning heart was just feet away, roaring like a tornado. "For Blackwood," Silas whispered, "for Sarah." And then, looking at the glowing eye of the machine god, he added one last thing. "For me," Silas leapt. He didn't fall. The magnetic field caught him. He floated toward the spinning sphere of mercury and light. As his body touched the surface of the heart, time seemed to stop. The green energy of the blight met the white-hot fury of a man who refused to be broken. There was no sound at first, just a flash of light that turned the world white. Then, the scream. The train screamed. The rails screamed. The very atoms of the iron split apart. Crackum! The engine core detonated. The explosion didn't push outward. It pulled inward first, collapsing the locomotive into a black hole of gravity and fire, before exploding outward with the force of a nuclear warhead. The skull-faced engine of the Leviathan shattered. The tender car disintegrated. The shock wave traveled back through the train, tearing the cages apart, vaporizing the rails, and turning the night sky into a pillar of fire visible for 100 miles. Silas Thorne was gone. He had become the fire. The Ghost in the Machine, epilogue, 3 days later. The Kansas wasteland. The rain fell hard on the scorched earth, turning the ash into a thick grey paste. It was a cold, clean rain, the kind that usually washes away sins. But the scar left on the prairie was too deep for rain to heal. A crater, half a mile wide, smoked in the morning mist. It looked as if a piece of the sun had broken off and struck the earth. Agent Graves of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency pulled his collar up against the wind. He stood on the ridge overlooking the crash site, his horse shifting nervously beneath him. Even the animals knew this place was wrong. "What are we looking at, sir?" His deputy, a young man named Collins, asked. Collins was pale, holding a handkerchief to his nose to block out the smell of ozone and burnt copper. "Official report says a boiler explosion," Graves muttered, chewing on his unlit cigar. "Unofficial report says hell opened up." They rode down into the crater. The ground crunched beneath the horse's hooves. It wasn't dirt, it was glass. Sand fused into obsidian by the heat of the blast. The wreckage of the Leviathan was scattered everywhere. Twisted beams of black iron, gears the size of carriage wheels, and miles of copper wire that looked like dried intestines. "Sir, look at this," Collins called out, his voice trembling. Graves rode over. Collins was pointing at a large, jagged piece of metal sticking out of the mud. It was part of a flatbed car. Fused to the metal was a hand, a human hand turned to grey iron, still clutching the railing. And further down, a face. It was shattered, like a broken porcelain doll, but the eyes, the empty sockets still seemed to weep a dry, rusty dust. "Mother of God," Graves whispered. "The rumors were true." "They say it was a plague," Collins said, looking around fearfully. "The Iron Blight. They say it turns men into machines. It's over now, Collins, Graves said sharply, though he didn't feel convinced. Whatever it was, it burned. The heat in this center must have been hotter than a foundry. They dismounted near the epicenter of the blast. This was where the locomotive had been. There was nothing left but a pool of cooling slag, shimmering with a faint oily rainbow sheen. Graves walked to the edge of the slag pool. Something caught his eye, a glint of gold amidst the black char. He reached down, using his gloved hand to pry the object from the hardened ash. It was a star, a sheriff's badge. It was warped, half-melted, and blackened by fire. But the word sheriff was still visible, and fused to the back of the badge was a small brass cog. Graves held it up to the light. It felt heavy, heavier than lead, and it was warm. Not residual heat from the fire, but an internal warmth, like a living body. Who was he? Collins asked, looking at the badge. The man who stopped it. Just a lawman, Graves said softly. A man named Thorne, Blackwood Sheriff. Graves stared at the badge. For a second, just a fraction of a second, he thought he felt a vibration in his palm. A tiny, rhythmic thrumming. Tick, tick, tick. He dropped the badge. Sir. Graves stared at the object in the mud. It lay still. No sound, no movement. It's nothing, Graves said, his voice tight. He picked the badge up again, quickly shoving it into his coat pocket. Just nerves. What do we do about the town? Blackwood. Burn it, Graves commanded, mounting his horse. We go back, we seal the perimeter. The army is already moving in to fence off the canyon. Blackwood doesn't exist anymore. It never happened. And the wreckage? Let it rust, Graves said. If we're lucky, nature will reclaim it before anyone else finds it. They turned their horses and rode out of the crater, leaving the graveyard of gears behind. But as they rode into the grey distance, Agent Graves couldn't stop his hand from drifting to his pocket. The badge was there, and it was getting warmer. He told himself it was his imagination. He told himself the nightmare was over. He told himself that the hero, Silas Thorne, had destroyed the heart of the machine. But deep down, Graves knew the first rule of the new world he had just glimpsed. Machines don't die, they just wait to be repaired. In the pocket of his coat, the cog on the back of the badge turned. Just once. Click. The end.